No.
Have to pull back for the night.
I was 42 years old when I first heard about the child who played with a hairy man in the forest, and in that moment, as a biologist specialized in primate behavior and wildlife conservation, I believed it was just another case of childhood imagination or a story misinterpreted by anxious parents, but I was wrong, profoundly wrong. What I discovered in the following months not only changed everything I thought I knew about the wildlife of the Cascade Mountains, but also destroyed my scientific certainty, my career, and, in a way, my own humanity. Because there is something out there, something gentle and impossible, something that shouldn't exist according to all the books I studied and all the experts I consulted throughout 2 decades of research. And when you look into the eyes of a creature like that, when you feel the deep and melancholic intelligence behind that almost human expression, you realize the world is much larger, much stranger, and much more tragic than you ever imagined. This is the real story of Sarah Mitchell, a 6-year-old girl who found something in the forest, and of my desperate attempt to protect both her and the creature she called her friend. It's also the story of how I failed. Before I explain what happened in the end, I need to tell you how it all began, because every detail matters. Every clue I ignored, every decision I made, thinking I was doing the right thing. If you knew what I know now, maybe you'd understand why I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that deep and haunting sound they make when they're calling to each other across the dark valleys. The first time I visited the Mitchell family was in mid-September 2019, on a gray and humid afternoon typical of the Pacific Northwest. Their house sat on an isolated property, surrounded by Douglas firs and pine trees that rose like green cathedrals until they disappeared into the low fog. Rebecca Mitchell, Sarah's mother, greeted me on the porch with that look I already knew well, a mixture of hope and embarrassment, as if she herself didn't quite believe what she was about to tell me, but desperately needed someone to take it seriously. She was an elementary school teacher, a practical and skeptical person by nature, which made her account even more unsettling. Her husband, Tom Mitchell, was a forest ranger, a man accustomed to the mountains and the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness, someone who could distinguish a black bear from a deer by the pattern of tracks in the mud, and yet both were visibly disturbed. We sat at the kitchen table, where Sarah was drawing with crayons while her mother prepared coffee and carefully chose her words. What she told me in those first minutes seemed innocent enough. Sarah had been mentioning for 3 weeks that she played in the forest with a big, gentle, hairy man who showed her things like wild berries and birds. At first, the parents thought it was an imaginary friend, something perfectly normal for a 6-year-old child. But then the specific details began. Sarah described the strong but not unpleasant smell of the creature, like wet earth and moss mixed with something animal. She spoke of his height, using the word giant repeatedly, and she drew his hands, large, with 5 fingers like ours, but covered in dark hair and with thick nails. When Rebecca asked Sarah to show me the drawings, I felt the first chill run up my spine. Because those childish drawings, made with the clumsy sincerity of a child, showed something that no 6-year-old girl should be able to invent in such specific detail. But before I tell you what I saw when I finally went into the forest with Sarah, I need to explain why I accepted this case. I carried my own moral burden. 3 years earlier, I had published a study ridiculing reports of sightings of unknown large primates in North America, classifying them as frauds, misidentifications, or simply imagination. My position was firm. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever they called it, didn't exist, couldn't exist. Biology simply didn't allow a reproductive population of large primates to survive without leaving concrete evidence. Bodies, bones, anything beyond blurred footprints and grainy videos. This stance earned me academic respect, but it also made me the enemy of an entire community of field researchers and witnesses who, I now realize, deserved more than my scientific disdain. When Rebecca Mitchell contacted me, it was precisely because of this reputation. She wanted someone skeptical and scientifically rigorous to investigate, someone who could prove that Sarah was confused or fantasizing, someone who would bring back normalcy. I accepted the case, not out of curiosity about Bigfoot, but because I was genuinely concerned about the child's safety. If there was someone real in the forest, a dangerous hermit or a predator, I needed to find out. And if it was just imagination, I could reassure the parents and move on. But deep down, in a part of me that was reluctant to admit it, there was also a trace of scientific curiosity, that small voice that whispers to every researcher, what if I'm wrong? What if there's something there that science hasn't discovered yet? I silenced that voice quickly, but it was there, dormant, waiting. On the 3rd day after that first meeting, I accompanied Sarah into the forest. Tom Mitchell came with us, carrying a rifle, and I brought recording equipment, cameras, and sample collection tools. The plan was simple. Let Sarah show us where she supposedly met this gentle, hairy man, document everything, find a rational explanation. Sarah walked ahead of us with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, following a barely visible trail that wound through the dense undergrowth. The morning was cold, and our breath formed small clouds in the autumn air. The forest was quiet, that peculiar silence that settles when even the birds seem to be waiting for something. After about 40 minutes of walking, Sarah stopped in a small clearing surrounded by ancient cedar trees, their trunks so wide that 3 people couldn't encircle them with linked arms. She pointed to a fallen log covered in moss and said, with the simple naturalness of childhood, "This is where we sit together." I examined the area carefully. There were no obvious signs of human presence. No trash, no footprints in the soft earth that clearly indicated anything larger than a deer. I was beginning to relax, preparing my speech about how imagination is a beautiful thing and how the forest can seem magical to a child, when Tom grabbed my arm and pointed silently to something I had missed. On the trunk of a nearby cedar, about 8 feet high, there were deep scratches in the bark, fresh scratches that revealed the pale wood underneath. The pattern was unmistakable, 4 parallel marks, as if made by fingers or claws, dragging downward with considerable force. But what made my mouth go dry was the height. Whatever made those marks had to be tall, much taller than a man, and powerful enough to gouge deep into the solid bark of an old-growth cedar. Tom and I exchanged glances. He had seen marks like these before, he told me quietly, years ago in a remote area of the national forest, marks that the rangers didn't talk about officially but whispered about around campfires. And then Sarah, oblivious to our tension, called out cheerfully, "That's where he sharpened his nails. He does that sometimes." The innocence of her statement, contrasted with the implications of what we were seeing, created a cognitive dissonance that made me feel momentarily dizzy. I took photographs, measured the scratches, collected bark samples. I was trying to maintain scientific protocol, but my hands were shaking slightly. Tom suggested we set up trail cameras in the area, and I agreed, though part of me was already uncomfortable with what we might capture. As we worked, Sarah sat on the mossy log, humming to herself and arranging small stones in patterns she said her friend had taught her. "He's very smart," she told us, unprompted. "He knows which plants are medicine. He showed me how his mother makes them into paste for when they're hurt." I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice calm and gentle. "Sarah, does your friend have a family?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, there's his mother and his little brother. The baby is funny. He tries to climb but falls down a lot." She giggled at the memory. "They live in a place with big rocks and a cave. He doesn't take me there because his mother is scared of humans, but he says she's very gentle, just scared." The specificity of her account was troubling. If this was imagination, it was remarkably detailed and consistent. Children's fantasy stories usually shift and change with each telling, but Sarah's narrative had remained stable, according to her parents. I asked her to describe what her friend looked like, and she did so with the matter-of-fact precision of someone describing a neighbor. "He's very tall and covered in dark brown hair, except on his face and his hands where you can see skin. His face is like ours, but different, flatter, with a big ridge here." She touched her own forehead. "And his eyes are brown and sad. He doesn't talk with words like us, but he makes sounds and I understand what he means. And he smells like the forest when it rains." Every detail she provided matched descriptions from hundreds of Bigfoot encounter reports I had read and dismissed over the years. The flat face with prominent brow ridges, the dark hair covering most of the body, the musky, earthy odor, the height, the apparent intelligence and gentleness. But hearing it from a 6-year-old girl, told with such innocent certainty, stripped away my ability to simply dismiss it as folklore or hoax. Because children, especially young children, don't typically fabricate consistent, detailed lies about creatures that match cryptozoological descriptions they've never been exposed to. Rebecca had confirmed that Sarah had never seen Bigfoot movies or television shows, had never been told stories about Sasquatch. The family wasn't part of any Bigfoot research community. There was no apparent source for this information, except, impossibly, direct experience. We left the cameras in place and returned to the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those scratches on the cedar bark, about the conviction in Sarah's voice, about the small detail she'd mentioned almost in passing, that the creature's eyes were sad. Why would a child invent that detail? Sadness implied emotion, depth of feeling, something beyond a simple monster or forest animal. It implied a thinking, feeling being, aware of its own situation. And what situation might that be? Living hidden, avoiding humans, existing in the shadows of a world that had forgotten or denied your existence. If such creatures were real, truly real, then their lives must be characterized by endless caution, isolation, the constant threat of discovery. No wonder the eyes would be sad. I shook my head, trying to clear these thoughts. I was letting imagination override scientific skepticism. But the scratches were real and documented. Something made them, something large and powerful. I decided to wait for the trail camera footage before drawing any conclusions. The cameras were set to record motion-activated video and had night vision capabilities. If anything came to that clearing, we would have evidence. Real, irrefutable evidence. And that's what I thought I wanted. Evidence. Proof one way or another. But what I didn't understand yet was that some kinds of evidence change you forever. That some truths carry a weight you're not prepared to bear. The cameras recorded for 1 week before we retrieved them. Tom and I went back into the forest on a Saturday morning, both of us tense with anticipation, though neither wanted to admit it. The weather had turned colder, and the first hints of winter were visible in the frost that lingered in shadows even as the morning sun climbed higher. When we reached the clearing, my first impression was that nothing had changed. The cameras were still in place, undisturbed, their indicator lights blinking to show they had power. But as we approached to collect the SD cards, I noticed something that made my heart rate accelerate. On the mossy log where Sarah said she sat with her friend, there was an arrangement of objects that hadn't been there before. 3 perfect pine cones placed in a careful triangle, and in the center, a cluster of bright red winterberries, still fresh. Tom saw them at the same moment I did. "Gifts," he said quietly. "I've heard about this. They leave gifts, arrangements, little signs." Some researchers think it's a form of communication, showing they're aware of us, maybe testing whether we're friendly or threatening. I wanted to dismiss this as coincidence, as animal behavior misinterpreted, but the deliberateness of the arrangement was unmistakable. The pine cones weren't just dropped randomly, they were positioned with care, points aligned. And winterberries don't cluster naturally like that. Someone or something had picked them and placed them there intentionally. I photographed everything before carefully collecting the cameras, making sure not to disturb the arrangement. We hurried back to my truck to review the footage, and as we drove down the mountain road toward town, I felt a growing sense of dread and excitement intertwined. Whatever was on those cameras would change everything, or nothing, and I wasn't sure which outcome frightened me more. We watched the footage in my motel room, with Tom sitting beside me and the laptop screen casting flickering light in the darkened space. The first 3 days showed nothing unusual. Deer passing through at dawn, a black bear ambling past one afternoon, an owl swooping down to catch something small in the grass. Normal forest activity, exactly what you'd expect. I was beginning to feel a mixture of relief and disappointment when the timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. on the 4th night, and something moved into frame. My breath caught. At first, it was just a shadow at the edge of the camera's infrared range, something tall moving between the trees with a strange fluid gait. Then it stepped fully into the clearing, and I heard Tom whisper something that might have been a prayer or a curse. The creature was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark hair that appeared reddish-brown in the infrared spectrum. It moved upright, bipedal, with a distinctly humanoid shape, but proportions that were all wrong for a human. Shoulders too wide, arms too long, head set forward on the neck without the pronounced curve of human cervical vertebrae. It approached the mossy log slowly, almost cautiously, and then did something that sent chills through my entire body. It looked directly at the camera. Not just a glance, but a prolonged, deliberate stare, and in that moment, I could see its face clearly. Flat, broad, with heavy brow ridges just as Sarah had described. But it was the expression that undid me. Intelligence, awareness, and yes, sadness. Those eyes, reflecting the infrared light with an eerie glow, held a depth of feeling that was unmistakably sentient. This was not an animal. This was a person. Different, but a person nonetheless. The creature held the camera's gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternity, and then looked away, apparently satisfied. It bent down, and with startling gentleness, picked up the 3 pine cones and arranged them on the log in that careful triangle pattern, then placed the berries in the center. Each movement was deliberate, precise, almost ceremonial. When it finished, it sat on the log for a moment, running one massive hand over the moss, and I realized with a shock that it was touching the place where Sarah had sat, perhaps catching her scent, or feeling the residual warmth, or simply acknowledging her presence. Then it stood, took one more look at the camera, and melted back into the forest with barely a sound despite its size. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes destroyed and rebuilt my understanding of the natural world. Tom and I sat in silence for a long time after the footage ended. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. What do we do? It was the right question, the only question that mattered, because now we knew. There was no more room for doubt or scientific skepticism. Sasquatch was real. Bigfoot existed. A breeding population of large, intelligent hominids had somehow survived in the remote forests of North America, hidden and undiscovered by mainstream science. And one of them had befriended a 6-year-old girl. The implications were staggering and terrifying. We protect them, I heard myself say. We protect Sarah, and we protect them. If this footage gets out, if people know they're here, especially know that one of them is interacting with a human child, I didn't need to finish the sentence. Tom understood. The clearing would be swarmed with researchers, media, hunters, sensation seekers. The clearing property would become a circus, and the creatures, these gentle, intelligent beings, would be driven away, or worse, captured, killed, turned into specimens or trophies. Sarah's friend, who had shown her berries and taught her about medicine plants, who left gifts and had sad eyes, would be hunted. We made a pact that night. The footage would stay secret. We would tell the Mitchells that the cameras showed nothing conclusive, just possible shadows that could be anything. We would advise them to keep Sarah away from the forest for her own safety, but we wouldn't explain why in detail. And I would stay in the area, monitoring the situation discreetly, making sure that if anything changed, if there was any danger to Sarah or the creatures, I would know. It seemed like the right decision at the time. Looking back now, I see it differently, because secrets have consequences, and protection can sometimes be a form of cage. For the next 6 weeks, I rented a cabin near the Mitchell property and conducted what I told my colleagues was field research on black bear behavior. In reality, I was watching, waiting, trying to learn everything I could about the creatures without disturbing them or drawing attention. I set up additional trail cameras in a wider radius, always careful to place them where they wouldn't be obvious, and I spent hours analyzing the footage frame by frame. What I discovered was evidence of a family group, just as Sarah had described. The large male, who I began to think of as the friend, appeared regularly. A slightly smaller individual, presumably the mother, showed up less frequently and always seemed more cautious, staying at the edges of camera range. And twice, I captured images of a juvenile, perhaps 3 or 4 years old in equivalent human development, clinging to the mother's back or playing in the clearing when they thought no one was watching. The juvenile's antics were heartbreakingly similar to young primates I'd studied in captivity, climbing, tumbling, testing boundaries while the mother watched protectively. Watching that footage, I felt a complex mixture of awe and guilt. Awe at witnessing behavior that no scientist had properly documented. Guilt at the intrusion my cameras represented. These beings valued their privacy, their hiddenness. Every camera I placed was a violation of that, even if my intentions were protective. I began to understand the ethical complexity of my situation. Was observation without consent ever truly benign? Was I any different from the hunters and sensation seekers I feared, just because my motivations were ostensibly scientific and protective? These questions haunted me, but I couldn't stop. The need to know, to understand, was overwhelming. I also monitored Sarah carefully, checking in with Rebecca regularly under the guise of following up on our investigation. According to her mother, Sarah had stopped mentioning her friend after we told the family to keep her away from the forest. She seemed sad about it, Rebecca reported, but obedient. "Children are resilient," Rebecca said with relief. "She's already starting to forget about the whole thing." But I wondered, did Sarah really forget, or did she simply learn not to talk about it because adults didn't believe her or didn't want her to? I remembered my own childhood, the moment when I realized that some truths were inconvenient to adults, that sometimes staying silent was easier than fighting to be heard. Had we done that to Sarah? Had we silenced her experience because it was too uncomfortable, too impossible for us to process? The thought made me deeply uneasy, but I told myself we were protecting her. Protecting her from what? I wasn't entirely sure anymore. From danger? From becoming a spectacle? From a friendship that crossed the boundaries of species and possibility? Maybe we were protecting ourselves from having to deal with the complications her experience created. That was closer to the truth, though I couldn't admit it then. Winter came early that year, hard and cold, with heavy snowfall that made the forest nearly impassable. My trail cameras continued to record, now capturing images of the creatures moving through deep snow, their tracks enormous and unmistakable. I documented everything meticulously: track patterns, stride length, apparent weight distribution, behavior patterns. The friend continued to visit the clearing regularly, even in the worst weather, always leaving some small arrangement of natural objects on the mossy log, now buried under snow. Gifts for a friend who no longer came. It was during this period that I became aware I was not the only one watching. Subtle signs at first, footprints near my cameras that weren't left by the creatures, but by humans wearing boots. Then, one morning, I found one of my cameras had been moved, not by animal activity, but deliberately repositioned. Someone else knew about this site. Someone else was conducting surveillance. I felt a spike of fear and anger. Who was it? Another researcher? A hunter? Someone from one of the Bigfoot organizations I had once mocked? The thought that my secret, the protection I tried to establish, might already be compromised made me nauseous. I started watching the watchers, as it were, trying to figure out who was invading this space. It took 2 weeks of careful counter-surveillance, but eventually I identified them. A team from a private wildlife research company that I later learned had contracts with several government agencies. They had thermal imaging equipment, sophisticated audio recorders, and the kind of resources I couldn't match. And they were methodical, professional, patient. They knew something was here, and they were building a case to prove it. I confronted them one afternoon in late January, approaching their camp directly. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s or 40s, all clearly experienced field researchers. When I walked into their camp unannounced, they weren't surprised. They'd known I was in the area, just as I'd known about them. We regarded each other warily, like animals circling, trying to assess threat level. The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Linda Chen, spoke first. "Dr. Martin," she said, using my name without introduction, confirming they knew exactly who I was. "We need to talk." We talked for hours, and what I learned chilled me to the bone. Their company, BioCore Research, had been tracking reports of anomalous large primate sightings for years, focusing on the Pacific Northwest. They had evidence from multiple sites, DNA samples from hair and scat that showed something that was almost human, but not quite, something that didn't match any known primate species. They had analyzed bone fragments from suspected burial sites, had audio recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any cataloged animal, had thermal footage from a dozen different locations. They were building an overwhelming scientific case for the existence of Sasquatch, and they were almost ready to go public. Not with sensationalism, but with peer-reviewed studies, genetic analysis, population estimates, hard science that couldn't be dismissed. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Dr. Chen looked at me with an expression that mixed determination and something like regret. "Because we know about the child. We know about the Mitchell family. And we know one of the creatures has been making contact. That's unprecedented. That's the breakthrough we need. Direct evidence of intelligent interspecies communication and social behavior. We need your cooperation. We need access to the family. To document this properly, to make the scientific case so overwhelming that the world has to acknowledge these beings exist and protect them." Her words sounded reasonable, even noble. Scientific documentation, legitimate protection, bringing these creatures out of the shadows and into conservation efforts. But I thought of Sarah, of how her simple friendship would be dissected and analyzed, turned into data points and academic papers. I thought of the friend, leaving gifts in the snow for someone who no longer came, his sad eyes looking into the camera. I thought of the mother, cautious and protective, and the juvenile, tumbling and playing. "No," I said, "you can't have access to the family. Sarah is a child, not a research subject, and these creatures have made it clear they want to remain hidden. We don't have the right to force them into the light, no matter how good our intentions." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "You don't get to make that decision alone. This is bigger than one man's misguided sense of protection. These beings could be facing extinction, and we wouldn't even know. Habitat loss, climate change, inbreeding depression in a small population, all of these could be threatening them right now, and without scientific acknowledgement, there can be no conservation efforts, no protection. You're not saving them by keeping them secret, you're condemning them." Her argument haunted me because it wasn't wrong, not entirely. How do you protect something that doesn't officially exist? How do you preserve habitat for a species that science doesn't recognize? The paradox was impossible. To save them, we might have to expose them. But exposure could be equally deadly, inviting exploitation, habitat disruption, the transformation of their forest home into a tourist attraction or research facility. There was no good answer, only terrible choices. I left their camp without agreeing to anything, my mind churning with ethical dilemmas that had no clear solution. When I returned to my cabin that night, I found Tom Mitchell waiting for me, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said, Echoing Dr. Chen's words, Sarah's missing. The bottom dropped out of my world. What do you mean missing? Tom's voice was tight with controlled panic. She slipped out this afternoon while Rebecca was working in the home office. We thought she was in her room doing homework. When Rebecca checked on her an hour later, she was gone. Her winter coat and boots are gone too. She left a note. He handed me a piece of paper with a child's careful printing. Gone to say goodbye to my friend. Love, Sarah. She had gone into the forest, into the winter wilderness, alone, to find a creature that might or might not be safe, that might or might not even be there anymore. A 6-year-old girl in freezing temperatures, in terrain that could be deadly even for experienced adults. And it was my fault. I had kept her from the forest, from her friend, and in doing so, I had made that friendship forbidden, mysterious, irresistible. I had created the exact situation I'd feared. How long has she been gone? I asked, already reaching for my emergency pack, my GPS unit, my satellite phone. Maybe 2 hours. We called the ranger station. They're organizing a search party, but you know these mountains in winter. If she's lost, if she's hurt. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. 2 hours in freezing temperatures, even with warm clothing, could be dangerous for a child. More than that, and hypothermia became a deadly certainty. We had to find her, fast. The search party assembled quickly, professional and efficient. Rangers, volunteers, even some locals who knew the terrain. But I knew they'd be looking in the wrong places, following standard search patterns for a lost child. Sarah wasn't lost. She had a destination. She was looking for her friend, which meant she'd go to the clearing, to the place where they'd met before. I grabbed Tom and explained my reasoning. He nodded, understanding immediately. We'll search there first, but we go alone. If we bring the whole party to that location, he didn't finish, but we both understood. If Sarah was there, and if the creatures were there, a large group of humans would terrify them, could provoke a defensive reaction, could destroy any chance of a peaceful resolution. We informed the search coordinator that we check the Northern Trail section, then headed out at a fast pace, using GPS coordinates to navigate in the fading afternoon light. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun sank toward the horizon, our breath making clouds in the freezing air. I prayed silently, desperately, to any force that might be listening. Let her be okay. Let her be safe. Let us find her in time. The forest in winter is a different world, beautiful and deadly. Snow-covered evergreens stood like silent sentinels, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of our boots, the distant cry of a raven, the wind moving through the high branches. As we approached the clearing, moving as quietly as we could manage, I raised my hand to signal Tom to slow down. We moved the last 100 yards with extreme care, not wanting to startle anyone or anything that might be there. And then we saw them. Sarah sat on the snow-covered log, her small figure wrapped in her bright blue winter coat, and beside her, close enough to touch, sat the friend. He was even more massive in person than on the trail camera footage, his dark reddish-brown hair covered with a dusting of snow, his broad back slightly hunched as he sat. Sarah was talking to him in a quiet voice, and though we couldn't hear the words from our position, we could see her animated gestures, could see the creature listening with apparent attention. Every few moments, he would respond with soft vocalizations, low hoots and rumbles that seemed almost like words in an unknown language. And then, as we watched in amazement and terror and wonder, Sarah reached out and took the creature's massive hand in both of her small ones, and he let her, patient and gentle. She was showing him something. It looked like a drawing on paper, one of her crayon pictures, and he examined it with what could only be described as interest and tenderness. It was the most remarkable interspecies interaction I had ever witnessed. A moment of pure connection that transcended everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between human and animal, between known and cryptid, between possible and impossible. And I knew, in that moment of witnessing, that everything was about to change. Because we weren't the only ones who had followed Sarah. Behind us, trying to move quietly but not quietly enough for the forest, came the sounds of other footsteps. I turned and saw Dr. Chen and her team, along with 2 people I didn't recognize, carrying professional video equipment. They had followed us, had tracked us to this location, and now they had a clear view of the clearing, of Sarah and the creature together. Dr. Chen raised her camera, and I heard the soft whir of recording beginning. The friend heard it too. His head snapped up, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of multiple humans. His posture changed instantly from gentle and relaxed to alert and protective. He stood to his full, enormous height, placing himself between Sarah and the direction where we were hiding, and let out a vocalization that was unlike anything I'd heard before. A deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. A warning and a summons combined. From the forest came answers, more vocalizations, and then I saw movement. The mother appearing from the trees with the juvenile clinging to her, both moving toward the friend and Sarah with obvious agitation. The friend made a sharp gesture, almost human in its clarity, telling them to stay back, to flee. Then he gently but firmly picked Sarah up despite her protests, holding her carefully against his chest with one massive arm, and began backing toward the trees. I stood up, breaking cover, Tom beside me, trying to show ourselves as non-threatening, trying to communicate somehow that we weren't a danger. "Sarah!" Tom called out, his voice cracking. "Sarah, it's Dad, it's okay!" Sarah twisted in the friend's grip, seeing her father, confusion and fear on her small face. "Dad, don't scare him! He's my friend! He won't hurt me!" The friend paused, uncertain, clearly understanding that this man was important to the child he held. For a moment, the entire scene hung in balance. Predator and prey reversed, protector and protected confused, friend and enemy impossible to distinguish. And then, the video team moved forward to get a better angle, and the moment shattered. The friend turned and ran, carrying Sarah with him, moving with shocking speed despite his bulk and his burden. The mother and juvenile disappeared into the forest in another direction. Tom and I ran after them, shouting, pleading, and behind us came Dr. Chen's team, and then the sounds of the official search party, drawn by the noise. Dozens of people crashing through the forest in pursuit. It became chaos, a nightmare of shouting and lights and people running through darkness that was nearly complete now, the sun having set while we watched that tender scene in the clearing. I ran until my lungs burned, following the tracks in the snow, Tom beside me, both of us terrified of what might happen if we didn't reach Sarah before something went wrong, before the friend's protective instinct turned to panic, before the situation spiraled completely out of control. And then, perhaps 200 yards into the dense forest, the friend stopped. We found him in a small hollow surrounded by boulders. Sarah still held carefully against his chest, his back against the rock wall, defensive but not aggressive. He was, I realized, trapped. He had run into terrain that had no easy exit, perhaps disoriented by panic and the need to protect the child, and now he was cornered. Tom and I stopped at the edge of the hollow, breathing hard, trying to look non-threatening. Behind us, the sounds of the search party grew louder. We had maybe 1 minute, maybe less, before this space would be flooded with people. "Please," I said to the friend, knowing he could understand tone if not words. "Please, give us Sarah. We won't hurt you. We'll protect you. Just please give us the child." The friend looked at me with those sad, intelligent eyes, and I saw him weighing options, trying to understand what was happening, what we wanted. Sarah, sensing his distress, put her small hand on his cheek. "It's okay," she said softly. "They're scared of you, but they don't understand. You can put me down. I'll tell them you're good. I'll tell them you're my friend." And the friend, with infinite gentleness, set Sarah down in the snow. She immediately ran to her father, who swept her up with a sob of relief. And then the clearing filled with people, rangers and searchers, and Dr. Chen's team with their cameras. And the friend, seeing no other option, climbed. He scaled the boulder wall with astonishing agility, finding holds that seemed impossible, moving up and over the rocks and away into the darkness above. Someone shouted to follow him, but the terrain was too steep, too dangerous in the dark. They'd lost him. Sarah was safe. The friend was gone. The secret was out. That night was a confusion of activity. Sarah was checked by paramedics and found to be unharmed, not even particularly cold, despite hours in freezing temperatures. She insisted repeatedly and firmly that her friend had protected her, had kept her warm, had meant no harm. The Rangers documented everything. Dr. Chen's team had hours of footage. The story spread like wildfire through local news, then national news, then international news. Child befriended by Bigfoot. Video evidence of Sasquatch. The scientific community erupted in controversy, debate, demands to see the evidence, accusations of hoax, and counter-accusations of closed-mindedness. And in the middle of all of it, I sat in my cabin and thought about sad eyes and gentle hands and gifts left in the snow for a friend who didn't come. I had failed. I had tried to protect them, and instead I had exposed them to exactly what I'd feared. The Mitchell property was besieged by media and curiosity seekers within days. The forest became a destination for researchers and hunters and everyone in between. The clearing where Sarah had played with her friend was trampled by hundreds of feet, turned from a sacred space of interspecies friendship into a tourist attraction. And the creatures, of course, vanished. Deeper into the mountains, away from the invasion of their territory. Trail cameras showed them moving away, the family group breaking up, dispersing to avoid detection. The last footage I captured showed the friend, alone, looking back toward the valley where Sarah lived, his posture somehow conveying loneliness and loss. Then he turned and walked away into the wilderness, and I never saw him again. Sarah was traumatized by the attention and by the loss of her friend. She stopped talking about him, stopped drawing pictures, retreated into silence. The Mitchells eventually moved away, seeking anonymity in another state, trying to give their daughter a normal childhood despite everything. I resigned from my position, unable to continue in a scientific community that I now saw as both too skeptical and not skeptical enough, too quick to dismiss and too eager to exploit. Dr. Chen's team published their findings, and after years of peer review and scientific debate, Sasquatch was officially acknowledged as an unknown hominid species requiring protection and study. Conservation efforts began, habitat preservation, laws prohibiting hunting or harassment. In the eyes of science and government, this was a triumph. A new species, discovered, documented, protected. But I think about the cost of that triumph. The friend never chose to be discovered. He made a choice to befriend a child, an act of remarkable courage and compassion from a being that had every reason to fear humans. And that choice, that gentle act of connection, led to exposure, pursuit, the loss of his home and his peace. Was it worth it? Are they safer now, acknowledged and protected by laws? Or were they safer in the shadows, hidden and forgotten? I don't know. I'll never know. What I do know is that some kinds of love and friendship exist outside the categories we try to impose, that consciousness and personhood aren't limited to humans, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for another being is to let them remain unknown. The friend taught me that, though I learned the lesson too late to save his privacy or Sarah's innocence. I still go to the mountains sometimes, to places where they might be, and I leave small gifts. Fruit, nuts, little arrangements of natural objects. I never see them. I hope that means they're safe, hidden, living their lives away from cameras and scrutiny and the dangerous curiosity of my species. But sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, I hear vocalizations echoing through the valleys, calls and answers across distances, families talking to each other in a language we don't understand. And I like to think that somewhere in those conversations, the friend tells a story to the younger generation about the small human child who wasn't afraid, who saw him not as a monster or a mystery, but simply as a friend. That's my hope anyway, that something good survived the chaos and exposure, some memory of connection that transcends species and survives despite everything we did wrong. The scientific community still debates what Sasquatch represents in evolutionary terms. Some argue they're a surviving population of Gigantopithecus. Others suggest they're a parallel evolution of hominids that diverged from our line millions of years ago. The DNA evidence is complex and ambiguous, showing markers that are almost human but not quite, something that doesn't fit neatly into existing taxonomies. They're building research facilities now, trying to study the creatures without disturbing them, using remote sensing and non-invasive sampling techniques. I'm not involved in those efforts. I couldn't be, not after everything. Because every scientific paper, every careful study, every conservation plan exists because we took the most precious thing these beings had, their anonymity, and destroyed it. We did it for good reasons, or so we told ourselves. Protection, knowledge, preservation. But I wonder if we ever asked them what they wanted. If we ever considered that beings intelligent enough to leave gifts and form friendships might also be intelligent enough to make their own choices about how they want to live. We made those choices for them, just as we make choices for all the non-human life on this planet, assuming our judgment is superior simply because we have the power to enforce it. That arrogance, that certainty of our own rightness is the thing I struggle with most. Not the exposure itself, but the assumption that it was our decision to make. Sarah is 17 now. Her parents sent me a letter last year, updating me on her life. She's doing well, they say, planning to study anthropology and conservation biology in college. She still remembers her friend, still speaks about him with love and longing. She understands, better than most, that the line between human and non-human is not as clear as we like to believe, that consciousness and compassion exist in forms we're only beginning to recognize. She wants to dedicate her life to protecting beings that can't protect themselves, to being a voice for the voiceless. There's poetry in that, I suppose. The child who befriended Bigfoot growing up to be a protector of all creatures that exist at the margins of our understanding. Maybe that's the real legacy of what happened. Not the scientific papers or the conservation laws, but one young woman who learned early that friendship and respect transcend species, that the other is not always enemy or subject, but can be simply friend. I hope she succeeds in ways that I failed. I hope her generation does better than mine at coexisting with the mysterious and the different, at preserving space for beings that don't want to be known or studied, just left in peace. That's what the friend would have wanted, I think. Not acknowledgement or protection or scientific study, just the freedom to live quietly in the forests he loved, raising his family in peace, occasionally reaching across the species divide to make a connection with someone who saw him truly. He gave that gift to Sarah, the gift of seeing and being seen, and we took from him everything in return. That's the truth I carry with me, the weight that never lifts. We documented a miracle of interspecies friendship, and in the process, we destroyed the conditions that made that miracle possible. The friend is gone now, vanished into whatever deep wilderness still remains, and Sarah lives in the human world where such friendships are impossible. They both lost something irreplaceable, and all we gained was data and evidence and the satisfaction of being right about something we didn't understand. On cold nights, when I can't sleep, I think about that moment in the clearing, when the friend held Sarah against his chest, protecting her from what he perceived as danger, even though we were her family, even though by every logical measure, he should have been the threat, and we the protectors. But he knew something we had forgotten. The threat doesn't always come from the different or the strange, but often from the familiar, from those who claim to know what's best. He was protecting Sarah from exposure, from the chaos that would follow discovery, from the machinery of science and media and public curiosity that would grind both of them into subjects and specimens and stories. He failed, just as I failed, but he tried. And in the trying, in that gentle act of sheltering a child who loved him, he showed more humanity than most humans manage. That's what haunts me most. Not that Bigfoot is real, not that we discovered and documented a new species, but that we encountered a being capable of profound compassion and gentleness, and our response was to hunt him with cameras and invade his home and take from him the only thing he truly valued, peace. If I could go back, if I could make different choices, I would. I would delete the trail camera footage, convince Tom to stay silent, tell Dr. Chen's team nothing. I would let Sarah keep her secret friend and let the friend keep his hidden life. But time only moves forward, and choices once made cannot be unmade. So I live with the weight of what I did and didn't do, and I hope that somewhere in the deep mountains, the friend has found a new clearing, a new peace, a new place to sit and watch the forest and remember the small human who called him friend. And I hope he knows, somehow, that she remembers him too, that the friendship mattered, that it was real and precious and worth everything it cost. That's the only redemption I can imagine. The only way to make meaning from the wreckage. The knowledge that genuine connection happened, even briefly, even impossibly, between two beings who had every reason to fear each other and instead chose love. Sarah chose it consciously. The friend chose it despite millennia of evolution telling his species to avoid humans at all costs. And for a few weeks, in a small clearing in the mountains, they created something that transcends biology and taxonomy and scientific classification. They created friendship, pure, simple, across every boundary we use to separate self from other. That friendship doesn't show up in Dr. Chen's scientific papers, or the conservation plans, or the government protection orders, but it existed. It was real. And nothing we did afterward, no amount of exposure or documentation or well-intentioned protection can equal the value of what was lost when we forced that friendship into the light and burned it away. This is my confession and my testimony. I was there. I saw. I failed. And I carry that failure with me every day, along with the memory of sad brown eyes looking into a camera, leaving gifts for a friend who wouldn't come, and walking away alone into wilderness that grows smaller and more invaded with every passing year. Child claims she played with a gentle, hairy man, a real encounter with Bigfoot. That's how the story is told in the media, in the scientific journals, in the documentaries that play on nature channels. But the real story is simpler and more complex, more tragic and more beautiful. A child loved someone who was different. He loved her back. And the world couldn't leave that alone, couldn't let mystery remain mysterious, couldn't resist the urge to capture and catalog and explain. So we lost the magic in the pursuit of truth, and I'm not sure the trade was worth it. That's my story. That's my truth. And that's why I still wake in darkness, hearing calls across the valleys, and whisper apologies to beings who probably can't hear me and certainly have no reason to forgive. But I say it anyway, into the silence and the night. I'm sorry. For Sarah, for the friend, for all of them. I'm so very sorry.